Let us move on to our next questioner at the microphone over there. Mr. Edelman.
Welcome to America, Mr. Mandela. I'm Ken Edelman. Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released in jail. You've met over the last 6 months 3 times with Yasser Arafat, who you have praised. You have told Gaddafi that you share the view on, and applaud him on his record of human rights and his drive for freedom and peace around the world. And you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst. I was just wondering, are these your models of leaders of human rights? And if so, would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies.
Charisma, poise, and strength of character. These are but a few words to describe the man whose treacherous journey from political prisoner to becoming the first black president of South Africa is perhaps the most widely celebrated underdog story in modern African history. Known all around the world as an icon in the fight against racism and discrimination, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela's successful fight against the deeply oppressive system of apartheid in his home country of South Africa would see him become the living embodiment of his famous maxim, "It always seems impossible until it is done." But to fully understand just how impossible the fight against apartheid seemed before its eventual overthrow, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. In 1951, Nelson Mandela became one of the first black lawyers to be called to the bar of Johannesburg. After having left behind his old life as a member of the Taiwo royal family, a young Nelson Mandela was thrust headfirst into the harsh realities of urban life as a young black man living in a South African society which since the year 1948 had been governed by a system of institutionalized racial segregation known as apartheid. The system of apartheid, which literally meant apartness in the Afrikaner language of South Africa's Dutch settler population, was the real-life manifestation of various theories of racial superiority which were promoted by a number of prominent 20th century Afrikaner intellectuals and religious leaders. Under the system of apartheid, South Africa was basically divided by a rigid line which splits the country into 2 radically unequal parts. The white community, which made up about 10% of the total population, enjoyed full voting rights and extensive privileges, while the non-white population, composed of black Africans, Asians, and mixed-race people, were deprived of voting rights and subjected to all kinds of rules and regulations which were designed to preserve the race-based class structure envisioned by South Africa's ruling elites. And in response to global criticism about the morality of the apartheid system, South Africa's intellectual, political, and religious elites each had their own rationalizations as to why they had chosen to support a system which to the naked eye seemed like nothing more than legalized racism.
Mr. Brinslow, if we could define a term that's intrigued me since you started to use it. You have said repeatedly that the non-European is different from the European. Now, in your mind, is different synonymous with inferior?
I think it is a generally accepted fact today that the non-European is at a lower stage of development than the European. That does not mean to say that they are inherently inferior. Circumstances amongst which they have grown up and, well, their whole cultural background and everything, their whole diet, which would lead to physical or physiological changes in their whole nervous system, would all lead to a general idea of inferiority amongst them when you compare the average non-European with the European. But I do not believe that the non-European as such is inherently inferior. He's merely at a much lower state of development at the present state of...
Well, let's take up that.
By far the largest church denomination in the Union of South Africa is the Dutch Reformed Church, with a membership of almost 2 million white and non-white members. With us this morning is Dominee Adrian Berger, Secretary of the Federal Council of Dutch Reformed Churches and editor of Die Volkte, the Transvaal Church magazine. Dominee Berger, you believe in apartheid as a way of life.
Yes, I do.
Why?
In South Africa.
Why is that, sir?
Because the race, which is in a lesser state of development, is by far in the majority here. And numerically, of course, they are much stronger. And because also I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved. And also everything we have done in the last 300 years and built up in the church and in the state should be preserved and not be swallowed up by an, I wouldn't say inferior race, because I don't believe it is an inferior race, but a lesser a race which is in a lesser state of development, that's all.
Perhaps you can answer this one question that's intrigued me for a long time. There are, I am sure, devout believers in apartheid who are also devout Christians. Can these two, apartheid and Christianity, in your opinion, be reconciled?
I'm quite sure that they cannot. One of the mystifying things to me is how anybody who claims to be a Christian can be a disciple of apartheid.
Do you find any conflict between apartheid and Christianity?
No, certainly not. As a matter of fact, our Dutch Reformed churches are doing much more for the Christianization of the non-white people in this country than any other Protestant church in this country and anywhere in Africa. We as Christians believe in the development of the non-white people, and we certainly try to develop them as far as possible by building their churches, subsidizing them in their church work, and we are also trying to give them leadership where they want it. And our experience is that these people prefer to be left in their own churches. As a matter of fact, there are 9 different non-white churches belonging to the Dutch Reformed Church amongst the non-white people. And they prefer that. There are instances when we come together on a higher level in conferences and sometimes also in their churches. We often come there as white people to visit them, and there are also instances where we even have communion with them.
Can you foresee any eventual end to apartheid in the Dutch Reformed Church?
The Dutch Reformed Church does not practice apartheid because we believe that integration is religiously wrong or ethically wrong. Certainly not. In theory, we have nothing against integration. It's only a matter of practical policy in this country. Now, for this moment, if conditions should change,
Apartheid, of course, is a name which was used by us to describe a change from the old idea of just segregating people. We wanted to indicate something very good. The moment the development of a free black state starts, it might be said that the Europeans settled there will be partners. But it doesn't take very long as the development goes on before the black man says, this is my country. And in that I wish to rule. You are welcome here as white people. You can be most useful to us. But this is our country. And there's no doubt about it. If in South Africa, the white man allows any form of partnership to develop, it will mean the gradual giving away of the country he has settled for so many years.
Mr. Prinsloo, what is the basic philosophy underlying apartheid as a way of life?
We Europeans who've lived in this country for more than 300 years have come to a conclusion which is strange to some people in the Western world, namely that the peoples of Africa, and so the Bantu people of South Africa, have a beautiful civilization of their own which is worth preserving. There are many facets of this civilization. For instance, the social warmth of the Bantu peoples, which we Westerners can rightly envy them. Now, we also have a peculiar Western adaptation to Africa. Therefore, we can say that the Bantu peoples are a flower and the Western peoples are a flower, each with a beauty of its own.
With the passing of the Population Registration Act of 1950, all South African residents needed to be classified and registered based on race in order for the state to determine the kinds of social, political, and economic opportunities that they could legally enjoy. An official body known as the Office for Race Classification was also set up by the government to monitor the process and help make final decisions on people who were considered racially ambiguous. According to South Africa's Race Classification Office, a person's race could not be determined solely based on their personal opinion. It was also necessary to examine how they were perceived by others, their cultural norms, and their standing in society. And so all sorts of rather absurd legal definitions and tests were devised by the South African state to help determine whether a person was considered white enough to enjoy the privileges of the apartheid system. One of such absurdities was the official legal definition of a white person in South Africa. According to the Population Registration Act of 1950, a white person in South Africa was someone who in appearance is obviously a white person, who is generally not accepted as a colored person, or is generally accepted as a white person and is not in appearance obviously a white person. As you can imagine, the crudeness of this legal framework resulted in some rather silly decisions, and it wasn't uncommon for people to be classified as white on one day and reclassified as colored the next.
I've heard that in the South Africa of today, you can be classified as colored simply by looking colored. Is this, in point of fact, true?
Well, I can give you quite a, which may seem amusing, but rather humiliating incidents that occurred in our country when the Department of Census started reclassifying people. They hauled people with the trams in the mornings out of the bus queues and took them up to the Native Commissioner's office. And some of the tests applied to tell a man that he was not colored was trying to pass a comb through his hair. And the comb stuck. He was told, you are other people whose noses were a bit flat were told, you're not a colored.
You see, the Population Registration Act was just one amongst a long list of draconian apartheid laws which were introduced by the South African government. With the passing of the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949, it became illegal for a white South African to marry a non-white person. And with the entry into law of the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, it became illegal for any white South African to have intercourse with a non-white person. But by far the most detested of all apartheid laws was the Pass Laws Act of 1952, which required every black African over the age of 16 to carry with them an internal passport at all times. For many black South Africans, the internal passport was the ultimate symbol of their oppression, as the pages of this document regulated every aspect of their lives. The internal passport was essential for identification, employment, and daily travel, and there was a risk of instant criminal prosecution if anyone was unable to show it to a police officer on demand. To all intents and purposes, the apartheid internal pass laws made black South Africans foreigners in their own country and served as a daily reminder of the second-class status that had been imposed on them by the ruling minority. Despite being subjected to a long list of draconian laws governing which restaurants they could eat in, who they could marry, and even in which grave sites they could bury their dead, South Africa's non-white majority had virtually no say in the creation of these laws and had no legal means of changing them. Under the apartheid system, black South Africans were legally prohibited from owning or renting real estate anywhere outside of the specially designated areas mapped out for them by the government. These zoning laws basically made it illegal for black South Africans to live in urban areas, and so the thousands of black workers employed in South Africa's growing urban centers were limited to living in the underdeveloped townships and shanty towns that sprung up on the outskirts of major cities like Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, and Durban. With vast reserves of diamonds, gold, and platinum, South Africa became home to some of the most competitive mining companies in the entire world. However, the success of South Africa's mining companies was not simply just down to efficiency and economies of scale. South Africa's mining companies also got a big helping hand from the apartheid system, which basically gave them access to a large pool of cheap black labor, thanks to government-mandated low wages and little to no workers' rights. According to a report by the UN, black South African miners during the apartheid era earned around $25 a month on average, while white South African miners earned 15 times more than the black average, at $375 a month. Black miners were also banned from joining unions or engaging in strike action, and had very limited means of protesting unfair dismissals or poor working conditions. Now, although both white and black miners worked side by side inside the mines, black workers were legally banned from occupying managerial or specialist positions, and so the average black miner was basically doomed to a life of unskilled hard labor with virtually no prospect of career progression. South Africa's gold mining companies were particularly notorious for the poor working conditions imposed on their workers. Black gold miners were typically lodged in workers' compounds where they lived regimented lives away from their wives and children. And after a long week of back-breaking work in the mines, their weekend entertainment usually consisted of betting on bare-knuckle boxing matches in the daytime and spending their evenings in government-mandated beer parlors where they drank a soupy low-alcohol beer which was made from corn and served to them in buckets. By contrast, their white foremen, managers, and mining company owners enjoyed a standard of living much higher than people of equivalent income and status in Europe and North America. Living in large houses with large compounds and an unlimited supply of cheap domestic labor, thanks to the various townships and shanty towns which were situated just close enough to ensure workers could commute to work each day, but sufficiently far enough to ensure that South Africa's elites could avoid coming face to face with the harsh realities of working class life. Even from the very earliest years of its inception, the apartheid system was a hot topic of debate both within and outside of South Africa. But regardless of whether they were white or black, any South African who dared to publicly speak out against the system was swiftly suppressed by the South African state with a range of draconian measures ranging from surveillance to imprisonment and even death. But it was against this very perilous backdrop that a young Nelson Mandela would rise to become the single biggest threat to the apartheid system and the powers that be. Mandela's first introduction into politics had come in 1944 when he joined the African National Congress at the age of 26. As the leading political organization for black South Africans, the ANC had been formed in the year 1912 with the sole objective of restoring voting rights to black and mixed-race South African citizens who had been disenfranchised following the formation of the Union of South Africa just 2 years earlier in the year 1910. However, over the years, the ANC had gained a reputation amongst many black South Africans as being an organization that was all bark and no bite. Not only had it failed in its primary goal of winning back voting rights for black South Africans, but it had also failed to prevent the creation and the expansion of the apartheid system. Rightly or wrongly, many of the ANC's founding fathers were fully devoted to their belief in the power of peaceful protesting and were strongly opposed to the use of violence as a means of achieving their goals. But as the apartheid system became more and more unbearable, many began to call for the ANC to adopt a more radical approach in its quest for freedom. Alongside other fiery intellectuals such as Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Ashby Umda, Nelson Mandela was involved in the formation of the ANC Youth League, which began steering the party towards a more direct approach in their fight against apartheid. In March 1950, Mandela was elected national president of the ANC Youth League, and under the influence of prominent communists such as Moses Kotane, he slowly began to view the struggle against apartheid through the lenses of Marxism. Unlike many other African revolutionaries of his time, Mandela drew inspiration from the writings of the likes of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Chairman Mao. Fueled by his newfound ideology, Mandela would spearhead the evolution of the ANC into a radical political machine which was capable of going toe-to-toe with the oppressive South African state. Working in alliance with other like-minded organizations, the ANC started a mass movement in 1952 known as the Defiance Campaign. This crusade of mass gatherings and public protests would mark the beginning of the ANC as a major political force in South Africa. And over the course of just 2 years, the ANC's membership would grow from just 700 to over 100,000. Nelson Mandela would also emerge as one of the leading voices against apartheid as he delivered speeches in front of large crowds and was arrested and tried in 1952 alongside other prominent dissidents like Walter Sisulu and Yusuf Dadoo. Nelson Mandela and his comrades were charged with the crime of statutory communism, which was a new crime introduced by the South African government's Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. But despite receiving a suspended sentence of 9 months hard labor, Mandela remained dedicated to the fight against apartheid. In addition to his day job as only one of a few black lawyers in South Africa, Nelson Mandela continued to play a leading role in the ANC, organizing mass demonstrations and mobilizing more and more citizens to rebel against the apartheid system. In 1960, the ANC and Robert Sobukwe's black nationalist splinter group known as the Pan-Africanist Congress organized a series of mass protests against South Africa's past laws. Thousands of protesters gathered to discard and burn their internal passports in what was one of the boldest public demonstrations against the apartheid system. At one of the demonstrations, the police opened fire on the crowd and 69 protesters lost their lives in what is now known as the Sharpeville Massacre. This incident would spark international condemnation of the South African state and result in multiple riots all around the country. In response to the outbreak of civil unrest, the South African government declared martial law and banned both the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress. Alongside other prominent dissidents, Nelson Mandela was arrested and imprisoned for 5 months without trial, and even after his eventual release, Mandela soon became one of the government's most wanted men, and an arrest warrant was issued against him. With the ANC now officially banned and a bounty on his head, Mandela was forced to go underground, living as a fugitive and mobilizing all those who were still brave enough to stand up to the South African state. During this phase of his life, Mandela will be dubbed the Black Pimpernel, thanks to his impressive ability to avoid arrest despite being one of the most easily recognizable men in all of South Africa. With the South African government continuing to make life unbearable for political dissidents, Mandela eventually decided in 1961 that it was time for the ANC to adopt a more direct approach in their battle against apartheid.
There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay at home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Drawing inspiration from Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement, Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Joe Slovo co-founded the militant group Umkhonto weSizwe, popularly known as MK. As chairman of the MK militant group, Mandela's first course of action was to seek international support and equip his fighters with as much military expertise as possible. Slipping out of the country through the neighboring Bechuanaland, Mandela traveled to Ethiopia, where he laid out the moral case for an armed struggle against apartheid at the 1962 Pan-African Freedom Movement Conference. Mandela then traveled to Morocco, where he received training in guerrilla warfare from members of the National Liberation Front of Algeria. From Morocco, Mandela then visited a number of Portuguese-speaking African countries, where he met with anti-colonial militants in Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde to gain insight into how they were executing their armed struggles against their Portuguese colonizers. But shortly after returning to South Africa to begin putting into practice what he had learned on his African tour, the Black Pimpernel was finally arrested in August 1962 and was hit with a 5-year prison sentence after being found guilty of the crimes of leaving the country without permission and inciting strike action. However, less than a year later in July 1963, the police discovered a number of documents which showed that the MK militant group were planning to execute a number of attacks on key government infrastructure. Mandela was then subsequently charged by Chief Prosecutor Percy Utah with sabotage and conspiracy to violently overthrow the government. The trial would go on for several months, and despite calls for Mandela's release by the United Nations and the World Peace Council, Mandela and his co-defendants were found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment, and sent to spend the rest of their lives at the infamous Robben Island prison. But rather than stifle the resistance against apartheid, Nelson Mandela's imprisonment would trigger one of the biggest human rights campaigns in modern history, as a global coalition of activists from all around the world began calling for the release of Nelson Mandela and the end of the apartheid system. The 1980s will see a serious escalation of violence as MK militants began executing armed attacks all around the country, and many analysts began to fear that the country was on the verge of a civil war. The political instability soon gave birth to economic stagnation, as many of South Africa's international investors became increasingly reluctant to pour their money into the country. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who alongside US President Ronald Reagan, was one of the two major world leaders that had refused to publicly condemn the actions of the South African state, eventually caved in to increasing pressure from British multinational companies operating in South Africa and asked the then South African President Peter Botha to release Mandela and enter into negotiations with the ANC. Unwilling to risk destroying his relationship with Great Britain, which would have meant further damage to the South African economy, President Peter Botha eventually offered to release Mandela on the condition that he rejected violence as a political weapon and asked the MK to stand down. In response to Peter Botha's offer, Mandela will be quoted as saying, "What freedom am I being offered while the organization of the people remains banned? Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." With Mandela unwilling to concede to the government, there was a further escalation of violence around the country as the MK continued in its armed struggle against apartheid, and the Botha regime tried to suppress an ever-growing movement of anti-apartheid activists and militants. In 1989, President Botha suffered a stroke and was replaced shortly after by Frederick de Klerk. With the fall of the Berlin Wall taking place in November of the same year, South Africa's new president realized that the world was seriously changing, and if the South African government ever wanted to be taken seriously within the international community, it needed to renounce authoritarianism and begin negotiating the end of apartheid. And so, despite some very strong opposition from his own party, President de Klerk arranged a meeting with Nelson Mandela in December 1989 and offered to release him provided he agreed to renounce Marxist communism and completely reject the use of violence as a political weapon in the fight against apartheid. Nelson Mandela rejected de Klerk's offer and insisted that the armed struggle was absolutely critical to ensuring an equality of bargaining power between both sides. Realizing that there was no way to coerce a man who had already spent 27 years of his life in prison fighting for what he believed in, de Klerk eventually conceded, and in February 1990, the South African government granted the release of Nelson Mandela and also legalized the ANC and other opposition parties. Walking out of prison a free man on the 11th of February 1990, Nelson Mandela was received by a large crowd of adoring supporters in an event that was televised all around the world. In his first speech after his release, he declared his commitment to pursuing peace and reconciliation with the white community, but also made it very clear that the armed struggle was by no means over and would continue until apartheid had been brought to an end and all of the ANC's demands had been met by the South African state. A few years after his release, the apartheid system was finally brought to an end, and Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first ever black president on the 10th of May, 1994. And true to his word, Mandela would indeed devote the rest of his life to promoting peace and reconciliation in South Africa. Despite facing pressure from many within his party to use his newfound influence to exert revenge and consolidate power, Mandela stood strong in his belief in the power of forgiveness and called on South Africans of all races to unite to build a true rainbow nation. His humility and commitment to pursuing peace and reconciliation would truly set him apart from many other revolutionaries turned presidents. In sharp contrast to the likes of Fidel Castro and Robert Mugabe, Nelson Mandela did not weaponize his popularity as a means of holding on to power indefinitely. And even to the frustration of many of his most ardent supporters, Mandela made a point of publicly demonstrating the kind of forgiveness that was needed to bring unity to the nation. In 1995, he traveled to the controversial all-white enclave known as Orania to visit the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called architect of apartheid. In the same year, he hosted Percy Utah, the very same state prosecutor that had got him sentenced to life imprisonment and had even called for his execution. His public relationship with the captain of South Africa's winning team of the 1995 Rugby World Cup would be widely applauded and even depicted in the 2009 movie Invictus. But while Mandela's willingness to forgive and devotion to pursuing peace and reconciliation may have made him hugely popular with Western media outlets, many of his supporters were ultimately left feeling disillusioned following the end of his 5-year term as president. Rightly or wrongly, the general belief held by many within the ANC grassroots was that the end of apartheid would usher in a sudden transfer of wealth and prosperity to South Africa's black population. Despite promising radical left-wing policies like imposing heavy taxes on the country's richest people and nationalizing the entire mining industry, Mandela's ANC did not radically change South Africa's economy or seek to forcefully redistribute wealth. But putting aside the question of whether such policies would have been beneficial in the long run, what remains clear is that nearly 3 decades after the fall of apartheid, South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world, with an estimated 93% of the country's wealth being held by around 10% of the population. Unlike in fairy tales and Disney movies, real-life issues are very rarely ever solved by the bravery and strength of character of a single man. Although Nelson Mandela's struggle may have brought about the end of apartheid, South Africa's long march towards greater unity and equality still continues to this day. But despite the many issues that have plagued his nation since the end of his presidency in 1999 and his eventual death in 2013, no one can deny Nelson Mandela's immense contribution to the pursuit of freedom and equality in his home country of South Africa. Once again, it's KB Taiwo for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video. And also consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/newafrica. Thank you so much for all your support, and until next time.